Hi there. So today I want to talk about signs, and I really want to address a question. The question is it okay to ask God for a sign? And the answer is yes, but often people will use a scripture out of the New Testament to support the idea that it is not okay. That is an ironic position. It's ironic because if you believe in God and you pray to God for anything, you're asking for a sign, whether you realize it or not. If you're asking God for God to move on your behalf or on someone else's behalf, if you're asking God to act in any way, whether it's a healing or provision or a blessing or something, if you're wanting God to do something, whether you know it or not, you're asking for God to manifest himself, and that will be a sign that God heard your prayer. It's interesting to think that there are people that believe that it's not okay to ask God for a sign, and yet they're doing it unknowingly if they're praying. I realize those two things are not the same thing, but they are. And anyway, we'll just dive into a couple of scriptures here. Before I get into the meat of what I want to talk about, I just want to remind you that Jesus once told the Pharisees in John chapter 2. He told a group of people that when they asked, "What is the sign that you can do these things?" He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up." So he gave them a sign. Now, it was not a literal sign. He was talking about his body, and the scripture goes on to say that. The scripture goes on to say that the disciples figured it out, and when they figured it out, then they believed in Jesus and the scripture. So Jesus prophesied a non-literal prophecy, a non-literal sign, and he gave that to a group of people that were asking for evidence that he had the authority to do the things that he was doing. Why go into that? Because people that say that God will not, because people that say that it's not okay to ask God for a sign will use a passage that seems to imply that God will not give signs. And he had just given this group of people a sign. So that's interesting to think about. And we'll just dive right into this one passage that I do want to get into. When people say that it's not okay to ask God for a sign, they will use a passage out of the Gospels. There are a couple. It's two different stories, but one of them occurs in all three Gospels. And the one I'm going to read from is Matthew 16. So Matthew 16 verses 1 through 4 says, "And the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test him. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. So he answered and said to them, When evening comes, you say, it will be fair weather because the sky is red. And early in the morning, today it will be stormy weather because the sky is red and darkening. You know how to evaluate correctly the appearance of the sky, but you are not able to evaluate the signs of the times." And here's the verse in question. Jesus says, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, and a sign will not be given to it except the sign of Jonah." And he left them and went away. So that's the scripture. It says a sign will not be given to it. In John 2, they had already asked for a sign, and Jesus gave it to them. But here, it says a sign will not be given to it, to this evil and adulterous generation. The heck of it is, Jesus didn't stop performing miracles. He kept performing signs. They just wouldn't receive it. And anyway, this is the passage that people use. And so they take a statement that Jesus made to a group of Pharisees, and in this case Sadducees too, that only an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. They take that and apply it to themselves and other Christians. So context matters. Now, let me talk about that just for a second. You can learn anything in the Bible. All Scripture is inspired by God for a reason. There's something to be learned from it. You can find that in 2 Timothy, I believe it's 3:16. And so you can learn from any Scripture. But what are you learning here? The context here is that Jesus tells this to a group of Pharisees and Sadducees. They're not going to believe him no matter what. But I want you to hold that thought, because I'm going to go to another verse. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, and a sign will not be given to it except the sign of Jonah. That's what he says to Pharisees. Matthew 24:3 reads, "And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came up to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?' And Jesus answered and said to them," verse 4, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will deceive many. And you are going to hear about wars and rumors of wars." There's the first sign. The disciples asked, "What will be the sign of your coming?" And he gives them a list of signs. I'm not going to read all of Matthew 24. Verse 7 says, "For nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places." He gives them a list of signs. So to those that would say that it is not okay to ask God for a sign, I would just say that Matthew 24:3 says differently. They asked for a sign. Now you can push back against that and say, well, they're asking for something different. They're asking for something in the future. That's not the point. The Pharisees, yeah, they wanted something right now. But the argument is it's not okay to ask God for a sign. The disciples had no problem asking Jesus for a sign, and he did not rebuke them, period. So it's okay to ask God. It's in Scripture. The problem is that people often read Scripture with blinders on. They don't think about other passages, and they don't consider the context. I get if you come away from one of the passages with the Pharisees and the Sadducees getting rebuked by Jesus, that you could come away thinking that it's not okay to ask for a sign. But in my mind, it's just natural to think, well, he said that to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What would he say to the disciples? And anyway, that question doesn't get asked. And unfortunately, church tradition has evolved, and people seriously think that it's not okay to ask God for a sign. Now, let me comment on that. I think it's okay. I think you can ask God for a sign whenever you want. I don't think God's going to answer every single time. I think you can turn asking God for signs into you can turn it into something that it's not supposed to be. At some point, faith is required. And so, are you asking God? Are you truly asking God in faith for a sign, or are you asking for certainty? Because certainty is not walking in faith. And I get it with something complicated, like, I don't know, moving to a town, changing jobs. You might want some clues. Is this really God's will? I'm not saying don't ask for a sign, but how many signs does it take? In no way am I rebuking anyone for asking for a sign. God can be vague with signs. Probably the most important scripture as far as trying to understand signs that we could go to would be a verse out of Exodus chapter 4, verse 8. I'm going to read that real quick and just briefly talk about it. Well, in Exodus chapter 4, Moses is asking for proof from God. He doesn't think the people will believe him, and so God tells him, you can perform these signs and they'll validate that I have sent you. And so one of the signs that he is to perform is to throw down a staff, and that staff will be turned into a snake. Another sign is to put his hand in his coat, and when he takes it out, it becomes leprous, and when he puts it back in and pulls it out again, it becomes clean. And then the third sign is to pour out some water on the ground, which will turn into blood. And he never actually has to perform the third one. But God tells him to do that. And in Exodus chapter 4, verse 8, we read, and this is God speaking, it says, "And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to the voice of the first sign, they will believe the voice of the latter sign." If they don't believe the voice of the first sign, they'll believe the voice of the second sign. Now that's interesting. The voice carries, or excuse me, the sign carries a voice. I'm not going to read the chapter, I'm not going to read the following verses, but Moses performs the signs and they don't actually speak. But the people understand. They realize when it happens. When they see the signs, they understand that God is about to act on their behalf. And so the signs spoke to them, even though the signs never actually spoke. And that's important. It's something to think about. From the standpoint of the people, you've got this guy coming along and he says that God sent him, and then he throws down the staff and it becomes a snake. Well, that would get your attention. You'd take him seriously. Unfortunately, we don't consider that God could do other signs without providing a mouthpiece to explain it. It's odd when you think about it. When God acts in somebody's life, sometimes you get a raise on the job, or I've had jobs that they created a position for me, and I knew it was God's favor upon my life. And sometimes people recognize that. Sometimes they just call it coincidence. And I don't think that every coincidence means something, but I know that God is more supernatural than we give him credit for, and we just don't take him seriously. When it comes to this sign thing, I'm amazed sometimes by people's take on it. I'm not trying to be divisive, but I don't mind saying that there are Christians that'll, I've seen them post memes on Facebook, Mark's safe from believing that an eclipse meant something. Mark's safe from believing that a blood moon meant something. And it's unfortunate that people downplay the Bible in that way. I get that people will sometimes believe that everything means something. Now that can hurt the faith. But if your reaction to it is to believe that nothing means anything, I question where you're really at. We can put limits on God unknowingly, and I think people do that. At any rate, I'll get off of that. I hope you got something out of this video, and I will see you in the next one.